What's up everybody? I hope you're all doing well, staying safe and looking after each other. Before we get into today's video, which is going to be about a lot of the F1 news that's happening in the background, a lot of talks happening about how the sport survives this mess that we're all in, how the teams might survive, some of the potential rule changes going on. There's lots happening behind the scenes, even though there are no cars turning wheels on circuits. But before I get into that, I just want to say a huge thank you for all the love and positive responses that I've had off the back of that Kids Ask Elvis video that I did on Monday. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. The questions were awesome. I loved making it, and it's one of those things I've wanted to make for a long time. It's a passion of mine in getting kids to embrace Formula One, because it doesn't happen so much anymore, does it? The demographic of Formula One viewers is aging. It's getting older and older, and we need to entice younger fans to our sport, into engineering in general. So it's always something I love to try and help with if I can, and I thought that was a really nice way to do it. So thank you to everybody who's enjoyed that video. The numbers haven't been great on it, to be fair. I'm not sure entirely why that is, but those who have watched it have clearly really loved it and been very kind to make those feelings known in the comments, so thank you. And likewise for the seat fitting video that I did with Jaguar. I filmed that, of course, a couple of months ago now, but it's been a long time in the edit, just bubbling away in the background. But I hope you found that interesting as well. Lots of people seemingly have, because it's a much more technical, highly advanced process than when I first started in racing, but I'm sure much more advanced and technical than many people would imagine. So if you haven't seen either of those, do go and check them out. They're the last two videos I made. Now we've got that out of the way though, let's get into what's going on behind the scenes in Formula One today. First of all, there's obviously loads of talk right now about how the sport protects itself, how it can really help the teams to survive, because that's a genuine threat right now, is that some teams, and therefore the sport itself, could really struggle to actually survive. That's a real problem that we might end up with. There are a number of teams that we already know are fragile in a best case scenario in Formula One, where they're reliant on a single sponsor or a single individual backing the team, and the massive financial incident could really tip some of these people over the edge. We saw it on a much lesser scale back with the financial crash of 2008, where the manufacturers in our sport all just exited. They just ran away and ditched everybody that was left behind, and that was probably nowhere near the impact that this current situation has the potential to go on to have. So we do have to think very carefully about how the sport looks after itself. You know, it's a sport that traditionally has been built on a kind of, I guess, an arrogance, isn't it? Formula One has had an arrogance that it's above all of this kind of stuff, that it can survive anything. But that arrogance has always been propped up on other people's money, if we're going to be frank about it. And all of a sudden, if other people's money disappears, well, then so does our arrogance, and so does the perception that Formula One is existing on a higher plane than the rest of the world, because it genuinely isn't. It's going to be affected by this in a very serious way. So lots of talk happening right now amongst the teams, amongst the stakeholders, about what we need to do. We've already heard about proposals that bring the budget cap down from $175 million to $150 million. It's a small step, and there's now talk of bringing it down even further to 125, although there are a couple of teams still against that. And what we're starting to see, after the really positive vibes that came out early on about how this sport was coming together in sort of solidarity to help the fight back against the virus, with things like producing PPE equipment and ventilator components and all these kind of great stories that were emerging, we're now starting to hear talk that we're kind of back to our old ways, where nobody can agree on anything, even if it's for the greater good of the sport. Everybody's still starting to bring their own agendas into this, like around the budget cap. Surely we need to just agree very quickly on some really extreme measures, and it might not be about who it benefits most of all, but more importantly, it's about protecting the sport and stopping the sport from collapsing. Because if that happens, everybody loses. In case you're wondering why a minute ago I was with the children on this walk and now I'm not, it's because I got all the way home only to realise that Ginger, who I gave the dogs leads to halfway around the walk, had left them halfway around the walk. The thing about all this budget cap talk, whilst it's really, really important, because assuming the sport survives this mess that we're all going through right now and comes out the other side, well, 2021 might get back to something more like a normal championship. And 2021 is when that budget cap kicks in. It's also the time that all the development will likely be happening, both for the 2021 car, but also for the new 2022 car. And that's when the sport will really be struggling, having had its prize money from this year massively deducted. Of course, they don't get paid this year's prize money until next year, so they will suffer next year, which is why those talks are really important. But as well as all of that, and even maybe more importantly than that in the short term, we need to protect the teams right now. And it's those discussions that again are going on in the background, but in my mind need to be accelerated, need to be the absolute #1 priority. That's about protecting the sport, protecting the teams in the immediate moment. So shutting down the factories, for example, extending the shutdown period, which we've done a few days ago, if you remember. That needs to be extended further, doesn't it? It needs to be extended in line with whatever local government shutdown restrictions are or lockdown restrictions are. Because what we can't have is some teams, as their country opens up restrictions, being allowed to go back into work and allowed to continue with development on the cars. So if the sport can enforce a shutdown where the factories are all locked down, if there's no racing, we will have to shut factories. Yes, there'll be casualties, because for the workers in those teams, in those factories, that means no work. But unfortunately, there are going to be huge numbers of casualties throughout this whole process, both in terms of health, in terms of jobs, finance, all sorts of things are going to suffer. I guess what Formula One needs to do is take a big picture look at all of this, protect what's most important of all, and that's the sport itself. If one or two teams fall by the wayside during this period of time, that could be devastating for the sport, much more devastating than it might first appear, because not only do you lose a couple of cars, 4 cars, maybe 6 cars from the grid, which is a huge chunk when we've only got 20 in the first place, but also you lose the attractiveness for other teams to join. You know, we're in a difficult period anyway. If a team collapses, there aren't going to be a handful of buyers out there ready to take them on after the difficult financial period we've just have gone through at that spell. But also, with a grid of much fewer cars, it becomes less attractive to things like sponsors. It becomes less attractive to investors. The whole sport will suffer if we lose just 1, maybe 2 teams. So that's got to be the biggest priority of all. Yeah, what's that, mate? That's yours, isn't it? The dogs are totally confused about why we got all the way home and then had to turn around and come all the way back out again. There's an argument to say that whilst governments are helping out in countries like right here in the UK, they're helping out small businesses and individuals financially, bailing them out, essentially injecting a whole load of cash to help the economy get through this difficult period of time. There's a good argument to say that Formula One or Liberty, the owners of the commercial rights of this sport, whose whole business model depends on it surviving, well, there's a great argument to say that they need to step in a similar way. And maybe they will. I'm not saying they won't, but maybe they will. And maybe that needs to be a priority, where they can maybe even inject some cash, maybe as bluntly as that, inject some cash into the teams that need it most. Maybe it could be in terms of some kind of loan, but we might need to do something to make sure that these teams just don't disappear right before our very eyes. The other thing that cropped up in the news yesterday, I think it was the comment from Jean Todt talking about how he would really love to tell the world what happened in that Ferrari settlement, but he can't, because Ferrari have banned it, have prevented that from happening. They've exercised their rights to keep that whole settlement private between the two parties. And Jean Todt's comments were almost of the nature of, look, my hands are tied. You know, I would love to be able to tell you what happened. You know, they've been sanctioned, but I can't tell you what they've been sanctioned with because Ferrari won't allow me to. Well, the whole reason Ferrari won't allow you to is because, Jean Todt and the FIA, that you allowed them to have that option in the agreement that you came up with. It's going to be quite interesting to see how, if and how, that story develops any further. Of course, Mercedes have now backed out of that whole argument. Of all of the non-Ferrari powered teams, which Mercedes initially were leading the charge on this, desperately fighting back, needing or asking for answers from the FIA, well, now there are only 6 non-Ferrari powered teams because Mercedes, after word from the very top bosses, the board at Mercedes-Benz, have decided to pull out of that argument. Now, that's an interesting story in itself, but I do wonder whether we'll ever get to the bottom of this Ferrari settlement thing. Red Bull say they will continue to fight back and continue to pursue it once the current crisis is over, but now they're a lot less strong. They're a lot less powerful without the might of Mercedes behind them. The reason I say it's interesting that Mercedes have now pulled out of that argument by word of the very top bosses at Mercedes, and I'm totally speculating here, but they also did a similar thing, if you remember, back in Australia during the conversations about whether or not the race should be postponed or indeed go ahead. At first, they were very much of the opinion that they should fight on, they should put on the show, and they should continue to race. And it was only after the very top bosses at Mercedes got on the phone to Toto Wolff and pretty much forced him to change his mind. Now, if the board of Mercedes are getting involved at such a high level, and at such a prominent level with such big decisions, public decisions like this, I wonder if that might have any bearing or might that be related in any way to Mercedes' future thinking around Formula One. You know, there's been a lot of talk about Mercedes pulling back as a team, pulling out of the sport even, maybe pulling back to being just an engine manufacturer. That feels like that's an even bigger possibility with the current crisis going on. And people are not buying road cars. Mercedes have done everything they could possibly achieve in this sport over the last 6 years. Do they need to continue to invest hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars every single year into a sport that actually might look very, very different once all this is over?